wrong house. My children are here. I'm a federal
Shut
judge.
up! Get on the floor!
I am Judge Monique Cole. Check your warrant.
You think that title protects you? You people think you're above the law.
In this house, I decide what the law is.
At 5:47 a.m. on a quiet Tuesday morning in the suburbs of Alexandria, Virginia, a flashbang grenade shattered the front window of a two-story colonial home on Maple Ridge Drive. The explosion lit up the living room like a strobe, sending glass across the hardwood floor and knocking framed photos off the walls. Before the echo faded, 12 armed federal agents in full tactical gear breached the front door with a battering ram and flooded the house, rifles raised, laser sights cutting through the smoke. Inside, a black woman in a gray t-shirt and pajama pants grabbed her two children from their beds and pulled them into the upstairs hallway. She crouched over them, shielding their bodies with hers, screaming at the top of her lungs. "You have the wrong house! My children are here! You have the wrong house!" The agents didn't stop. One of them, later identified as Sergeant Kyle Briggs, reached her in seconds. He grabbed her by the back of the neck, drove her face first into the carpet, and zip-tied her wrists behind her back, while she screamed her name over and over. Her 8-year-old son James tried to reach for her and was shoved backward into the wall by another agent. Her 5-year-old daughter Amara stood frozen, barefoot on the hallway carpet, silent, eyes wide, not crying, not moving, just watching her mother pinned to the floor by men in black helmets. What none of those agents knew, what their briefing had deliberately failed to mention, was that the woman face down on that carpet was Judge Monique Cole, a sitting federal judge on the United States District Court, appointed by the President, confirmed by the Senate, one of the highest-ranking judicial officers in the state. The raid was built on a fabricated terrorism tip, and the people who built the case knew exactly who she was. They just didn't think she'd survive it. Monique Cole didn't grow up in the kind of house that got raided at dawn. She grew up in the kind of house that got forgotten. A 2-bedroom unit in the Gilmore Homes public housing project in West Baltimore, where the hallways smelled like bleach and the elevators never worked. Her mother, Lorraine, raised her alone, working double shifts as a hospital janitor and walking Monique to school every morning before the sun came up. There was no father in the picture, no safety net, no inheritance. Just a woman who told her daughter every single day that the world would try to tell her what she couldn't be, and that her only job was to prove it wrong. Monique listened. She earned a full scholarship to Howard University, graduated summa cum laude, and was accepted to Yale Law School, where she was one of only 11 black women in her class. She clerked for a Supreme Court justice, spent a decade as a federal prosecutor specializing in civil rights cases, and built a reputation for going after the cases no one else wanted to touch. Police brutality, prosecutorial misconduct, corruption inside the agencies that were supposed to protect people who looked like her. At 39, she was nominated to the federal bench. At 44, she was one of the most respected and most feared judges in the district. Officers she had sentenced despised her. Agencies she had embarrassed wanted her gone. Political figures called her rulings activist overreach. She didn't care. She lived modestly in a quiet suburb with her 2 children, James and Amara. Her husband, a Marine named David Cole, had been killed in Afghanistan 4 years earlier. She carried that loss in silence and poured everything she had into her children and her work. The legal community admired her. The people she held accountable feared her. And someone, somewhere inside the federal government, had decided she needed to be destroyed. 3 months before that flashbang grenade shattered her window, Judge Monique Cole sat behind the bench in Courtroom 4 of the federal courthouse and delivered a ruling that sent shockwaves through every law enforcement agency in the region. The case was United States versus Dreyer, a multi-agency corruption trial that had exposed something ugly at the core of the system. A regional FBI field office and 3 local police departments had been colluding for years to fabricate evidence against black community organizers, planting informants in civil rights groups, manufacturing probable cause for raids, and arresting people whose only crime was organizing voter registration drives in neighborhoods the government wanted to keep quiet. Judge Cole didn't just rule against the government, she dismantled them. She issued sanctions against the FBI's regional office, struck 11 pieces of fabricated evidence from the record, and referred 2 FBI agents and a deputy U.S. attorney for formal disciplinary review. Her written opinion was 94 pages long and described what she called a deliberate and systemic campaign to criminalize constitutionally protected activity targeting black citizens. The ruling made national headlines. Legal scholars called it one of the most significant judicial rebukes of federal law enforcement in a decade. Inside the regional FBI office, the reaction was quiet and venomous. No one challenged the ruling publicly, but behind closed doors, in break rooms and on encrypted messaging threads, conversations began. Not about reforming the office, not about accountability, about her, about how to discredit her, how to neutralize the judge who had humiliated them on the national stage. The conversations weren't official. They didn't appear on any record. They moved through back channels, old favors, and a culture of retaliation that had been baked into that office for years. A culture where challenging the Bureau meant becoming a target. And in every one of those conversations, one name kept surfacing: Supervisory Special Agent Richard Hale. Richard Hale was 51 years old and had spent 24 of those years inside the FBI. He had joined straight out of law school, climbed fast, and by his mid-30s was running the Regional Counterterrorism Task Force, a position that gave him enormous power and almost no oversight. He had a reputation for results. His unit had the highest case closure rate in the region. Federal prosecutors loved working with him because his files were always thick, his witnesses always cooperative, his evidence always just compelling enough to secure indictments. But people inside the Bureau who paid closer attention knew what that record was built on. Hale cut corners. He pressured informants into saying what he needed them to say. He constructed cases on shaky intelligence and buried contradictory evidence deep in files that defense attorneys rarely had time to fully review. He had been the subject of 2 internal reviews, both of which were closed without action after senior officials intervened on his behalf. He operated in the space between legal and defensible, and he had never once been held accountable for crossing the line. Until Judge Cole. Hale was one of the agents sanctioned in the Dreyer ruling. His name appeared 14 times in the judge's opinion. She described his unit's conduct as reckless, deceptive, and fundamentally incompatible with the constitutional obligations of federal law enforcement. For a man who had spent 2 decades believing he was untouchable, the ruling felt like a personal attack. And Hale responded the way he always did when someone challenged him. He went on offense. Quietly, methodically, without authorization. He began building a file on Monique Cole. Not through official channels, not through any sanctioned investigation. He used a confidential informant named Raymond Sykes, a man with a 15-year criminal history who had been facing drug trafficking charges and would say anything to anyone if it meant shaving time off his sentence. Hale coached Sykes over a series of meetings to fabricate a connection between Judge Cole and a domestic terrorism network. Sykes claimed that Monique had been funneling money through a fake charity to an extremist organization with ties to violent anti-government activity. None of it was true. Not a single word. But on paper, with Hale's hand guiding the narrative, it looked just real enough to move forward. Hale didn't build the case alone. He couldn't. A fabrication this size needed layers, enough paperwork and procedural scaffolding to make it look legitimate from the outside, even if the inside was hollow. So he pulled in people he trusted. Not people who believed in the case. People who owed him. People who were afraid of him. People who had learned over the years that when Richard Hale asked for something, you gave it to him and didn't ask questions. The first step was the paper trail. Hale's team took Monique Cole's legitimate financial records and began manipulating them. Charitable donations she had made to community organizations were reframed as suspicious transfers. A contribution to a Baltimore youth literacy program was flagged as a potential front. Wire transfers to her mother's bank account for medical expenses were tagged as structuring, a term used to describe deliberate evasion of federal reporting thresholds. None of it held up under honest scrutiny. But Hale wasn't building a case for trial. He was building a case for a warrant. Next came the FISA court order. Using Raymond Sykes' fabricated testimony as justification, Hale's team submitted a classified application to the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court requesting access to Monique's personal devices, her phone, her laptop, her home network. The application described her as a suspected financier of domestic terrorism with potential ties to foreign extremist networks. The FISA court, operating in secrecy as it always did, approved the order. Hale's team then cherry-picked metadata from her devices, pulling timestamps, GPS coordinates, and communication logs completely out of context to construct a pattern of behavior that looked damning on paper but meant nothing in reality. The affidavit was drafted by Hale's deputy and signed by a junior agent named Terrence Polk, 28 years old, 2 years on the job, too green and too intimidated to push back. Polk later admitted he hadn't read the full file. He signed because Hale told him to sign. The affidavit was then submitted to a federal magistrate in a neighboring district, Judge Arthur Brennan, a man with a long and quiet history of rubber-stamping bureau requests. Brennan signed the warrant and the arrest authorization without requesting a hearing or asking a single clarifying question. At no point in the affidavit, in the FISA application, in the briefing materials, or in any communication between Hale's team and the magistrate was it mentioned that the target of the raid was a sitting United States federal judge. That detail was deliberately omitted. When a member of Hale's team raised the issue internally, asking whether the target's judicial status needed to be disclosed, Hale shut it down immediately. "She's a civilian target with potential access to classified legal proceedings," he said. "That makes her more dangerous, not less." The framing was intentional. It made the raid seem more urgent. It justified the tactical entry. And it ensured that no one in the chain of approval would think twice about what they were authorizing. The evening before the raid, the house on Maple Ridge Drive was quiet. Monique sat at the kitchen table with James, helping him finish a history project on Thurgood Marshall. He had chosen the topic himself. She watched him carefully copy a quote onto his poster board in neat block letters, his tongue pressed against the corner of his lip in concentration, and she smiled without saying anything. Amara was already in her pajamas, curled against Monique's side on the couch while she read from a picture book about a girl who wanted to be an astronaut. Amara fell asleep before the last page. Monique carried her to bed, tucked the blanket under her chin, and stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her breathe. She went back downstairs, reviewed a set of case files for a hearing scheduled later that week, made notes in the margins, and set them in her bag by the front door. She texted her mother goodnight. Lorraine replied with a heart emoji and a reminder to eat something. Monique locked the doors, turned off the lights, and set her alarm for 6:30. She climbed into bed and closed her eyes, unaware that in less than 7 hours, men with rifles would be standing over her children. Across town, inside the FBI Regional Field Office, the tactical team assembled in a windowless briefing room at 10:15 p.m. 12 agents sat in rows of metal chairs, body armor already strapped on, helmets resting on their knees. Richard Hale stood at the front of the room beside a projected photograph of Monique Cole. He described her as a high-risk domestic terrorism suspect with potential access to weapons and sensitive government information. He said the target had connections to extremist financing networks and may attempt to destroy evidence if given warning. He recommended full tactical entry, pre-dawn breach, flashbangs authorized. Several agents exchanged glances. One of them, a junior agent named Maya Chen, 29, stared at the photograph and then leaned toward her partner. She whispered 4 words. "Isn't she a judge?" Her partner, a senior agent with 11 years on the job, didn't look at her. He kept his eyes on Hale and muttered back, "Keep quiet and follow the briefing." Chen sat back in her chair, jaw tight, hands clasped. She didn't say another word, but she didn't forget. At the bottom of the briefing sheet, in small print beneath the operational parameters and the rules of engagement, a single line noted that minor children may be present at the target location. No one read it aloud. No one discussed it. The briefing ended at 10:48 p.m. The team was told to report for deployment at 4:30 a.m. As agents filed out of the room, Hale remained at the front, arms crossed, watching them leave. He had set everything in motion. The warrant was signed. The team was ready. The target was asleep. And by morning, he believed, the judge who had humiliated him would be finished. At 5:47 a.m., the battering ram hit the front door of the house on Maple Ridge Drive with a single blow that splintered the frame and sent the deadbolt flying across the foyer. Half a second later, a flashbang grenade came through the shattered living room window and detonated against the hardwood floor. The explosion was deafening. It blew out the glass on 3 picture frames, knocked a vase off the mantel, and filled the ground floor with a burst of white light and thick, acrid smoke. Before the echo died, 12 agents in full tactical gear poured through the doorway, rifles raised, boots hammering across the floor, laser sights sweeping through the haze. Upstairs, Monique woke to the sound of the blast. For one disoriented second, she thought something had exploded in the kitchen. Then she heard the boots, the shouting, the voices barking commands she couldn't yet make out. She threw back the covers and ran. She reached James's room first. He was sitting up in bed, eyes wide, mouth open, too scared to scream. She grabbed him by the arm and pulled him into the hallway. Then Amara. Her daughter was standing in her doorway, barefoot, clutching a stuffed rabbit, completely still. Monique scooped her up with one arm and pulled both children to the floor, pressing them beneath her, shielding them with her body. She screamed down the stairwell. "My name is Monique Cole. I am a federal judge. You have the wrong house. My children are here. Do not come up here with weapons around my children." They came anyway. Sergeant Kyle Briggs was the first agent up the stairs. He was 36 years old, built heavy, with a reputation on the tactical team for moving fast and asking questions later. He saw a woman crouched over 2 children in a dark hallway, and he didn't pause. He grabbed Monique by the hair, wrenched her backward, and drove her face first into the carpet. She screamed again. "I'm a federal judge! I'm a federal judge!" Briggs planted a knee in her lower back, pulled her arms behind her, and zip-tied her wrists so tight the plastic cut into her skin immediately. "Shut your mouth," he said. "Stop resisting." She wasn't resisting. James lunged toward his mother, crying, reaching for her. A second agent caught him by the shoulder and shoved him backward into the wall, hard enough to knock the air out of him. The boy slid to the floor, gasping, his eyes locked on his mother's face pressed sideways into the carpet. Amara was pulled from where she had been clinging to Monique's leg. She screamed as an agent carried her down the hallway and into the master bedroom, closing the door behind them. Monique could hear her daughter wailing through the wall. She couldn't move. She couldn't reach either of her children. She lay face down on the carpet for 11 minutes. While she was pinned to the floor, agents moved through the house with methodical aggression. They pulled books off shelves and threw them on the floor. They overturned furniture. They emptied kitchen drawers. They seized her laptop from the kitchen table, her personal journals from the nightstand, and her legal files from the bag by the front door. Those files contained sealed federal case documents, judicial correspondence, and privileged attorney communications, materials protected by judicial immunity and constitutional separation of powers. None of the agents hesitated. None of them asked what the documents were. They bagged everything. It was during the search of the kitchen that an agent named Torres opened a leather folio and found what was inside. A federal judicial identification card. A photo of Monique Cole. The words United States District Court Judge beneath her name. He stared at it for 3 full seconds. Then he looked up, turned toward the hallway, and called the team leader over. His voice was barely above a whisper, but everyone in the room heard it. "She's a judge. She's a federal judge." The room went quiet. The team leader, Agent Vargas, stood in the doorway between the living room and the hallway, holding the judicial ID in one hand and his radio in the other. Monique was still face down on the carpet, zip-tied, bleeding slightly from a rug burn that ran from her cheekbone to her jaw. James sat against the wall with his knees pulled to his chest, shaking. Amara's screams from behind the bedroom door had turned into a low, steady sob that hadn't stopped. Vargas keyed his radio. "Command, this is Vargas on scene at the target location. We have a situation. The target is identifying as a federal judge. We found judicial credentials, requesting guidance." There was a pause. Then Hale's voice came through, flat, controlled, and unmistakably deliberate. "Continue the search. Secure all materials. Transport the subject for processing." Vargas didn't move. He looked at the ID again. He looked at Monique on the floor. He looked at the child against the wall. His hand stayed on the radio. From behind him, a voice broke the silence. Maya Chen stepped forward from the group of agents near the stairwell. She was still in full tactical gear, helmet on, rifle lowered. Her voice was steady but firm. "I'm not participating in this any further. That woman is a sitting federal judge on the United States District Court. If we transport her for processing, every single person in this house will be facing federal charges. Not administrative review, federal charges. Obstruction of justice, assault on a judicial officer, deprivation of rights under color of law. This is over." Briggs turned toward her. "We have orders. Stand down and do your job." Chen didn't flinch. "Our orders are unlawful, and if you touch her again, I will personally file the complaint myself." The room split. Briggs looked to Vargas for backup. Another agent stepped closer to Chen, not threatening, but watching. Vargas raised a hand. "Quiet. Everybody quiet." He pulled out his personal phone and dialed a number that bypassed Hale entirely. He called the FBI's Office of Professional Responsibility directly. The call lasted less than 4 minutes. When Vargas lowered the phone, his face had changed. He looked at the team and spoke in a voice that left no room for argument. "Stand down. Weapons safe. Nobody touches anything else. We're done." Briggs exhaled through his nose. "This is going to blow back on all of us." Chen looked at him. "It already has." An agent opened the bedroom door and brought Amara back into the hallway. The girl's face was swollen from crying, her pajamas damp. She ran to her mother, who was still on the floor, still zip-tied. Monique couldn't hold her. She could only press her face against her daughter's hair and whisper that it was okay, that it was over, that Mommy was right here. But her hands were still bound behind her back. The order to release her hadn't come yet. When it finally did, 3 minutes later, an agent knelt beside her and cut the zip ties with a pair of trauma shears. The plastic had left deep red welts on both wrists. Monique sat up slowly, pulled both children into her arms, and held them on the floor of her own hallway surrounded by broken glass, overturned furniture, and the scattered remains of the life she had built. She didn't cry. She didn't shout. She looked at Vargas, and in a voice so controlled it made every agent in the room look away, she said 5 words. "Get out of my house." Monique didn't move from the hallway floor for a long time. She sat with her back against the wall, James under one arm, Amara under the other, and she held them in the wreckage of their home. The living room was destroyed. The couch had been flipped. Bookshelves were emptied across the floor. Broken glass from the front window glittered across the hardwood, catching the early morning light that was now streaming through the hole where the flashbang had come through. The smell of chemical residue hung in the air, sharp and metallic, mixing with the cold draft from outside. James was shaking. Not crying anymore, just shaking. His eyes were open but unfocused, staring at a point on the far wall. He hadn't spoken a word since the agent shoved him. When Monique whispered his name, he didn't respond. She pressed her lips to the top of his head and held him tighter. Amara had wet herself at some point during the ordeal. Her pajama pants were soaked, and she clung to Monique's shirt with both fists, her face buried against her mother's chest, making small hiccuping sounds that came in waves. She hadn't let go since the zip ties were cut. Outside, the remaining agents stood on the front lawn in a loose cluster. Some had removed their helmets. A few spoke quietly into phones. None of them looked at the house. Neighbors had begun gathering on the sidewalk across the street, some in bathrobes, some holding coffee, all of them staring at the tactical vehicles parked along the curb and the shattered front window of a home they had walked past 1,000 times. A woman 3 doors down was already recording on her phone. A man in a veteran's cap stood at the edge of his driveway with his arms crossed, watching the agents with an expression that sat somewhere between anger and disbelief. At 6:31 a.m., a silver sedan screeched to a stop at the end of the driveway. Lorraine Cole, 68 years old, barely 5 feet tall, got out of the car before the engine was fully off. She saw the broken window, the agents, the tactical gear, and she started running. She pushed past the first agent she reached, shoving his arm aside when he tried to stop her. "Where is my daughter? Where are my grandchildren?" "What did you do?" A second agent stepped into her path and she screamed in his face. "That is a federal judge's house! Do you understand what you've done? Get away from me! Get away from this house!" She found Monique and the children on the hallway floor and dropped to her knees beside them. She pulled Amara into her arms and pressed James's head against her shoulder and said nothing for a long time. She just held them. By 7:15, local police arrived, called by neighbors. They were confused. No one had notified them of a federal operation in their jurisdiction. They stood on the lawn exchanging tense words with the remaining FBI agents who refused to answer questions and said only that the matter was classified. By 8 o'clock, the first news van appeared. By 8:30, there were 4. Cameras were rolling from the street. A helicopter circled overhead. The FBI issued no statement. Hale was unreachable. His phone went straight to voicemail. The agents who had conducted the raid were ordered back to the field office by a terse call from the regional director's assistant. They were told to speak to no one, write nothing, and wait for further instructions. Inside the house, Monique sat at her kitchen table, the same table where James had worked on his Thurgood Marshall project the night before. The poster board was still there, now crumpled on the floor where an agent had knocked it off. She picked up her phone and made 2 calls. The first was to Chief Judge Harold Whitmore of the Eastern District of Virginia. She told him what had happened. He was silent for 10 seconds before he said he would handle it personally. The second call was to the Office of the Attorney General of the United States. She was transferred 3 times. When she finally reached a senior aide, she spoke 1 sentence, her voice low and perfectly controlled. "They raided my home, terrorized my children, and put me on the floor in zip ties. I want every name, every document, and every recording, and I want them by end of day." She hung up and set the phone on the table. Then she looked at her mother, who was rocking Amara in her arms, and said quietly, "They picked the wrong house." By noon, the Department of Justice Office of the Inspector General had opened an emergency investigation, the fastest activation of its kind in over a decade. The sealed FISA application that had authorized surveillance of Judge Monique Cole's personal devices was pulled from the classified archive and placed under immediate review by a team of senior attorneys with top-secret clearance. What they found took less than 2 hours to dismantle. The informant's claims were unsubstantiated. Raymond Sykes, the confidential source whose testimony had formed the backbone of the application, had no verifiable connection to any terrorism network. His statements were internally contradictory, unsupported by independent evidence, and in several places appeared to have been scripted. The financial evidence was manipulated. Charitable donations to legitimate organizations had been reframed as suspicious transfers. Routine wire transfers to Monique's mother had been flagged as structuring, despite falling well below federal reporting thresholds. Metadata from her personal devices had been stripped of context and arranged to suggest patterns that didn't exist. And the omission of Monique's judicial status from every document in the file, the warrant application, the FISA request, the tactical briefing, the affidavit, was deemed deliberate. Not an oversight, not a clerical error, a conscious decision to hide the identity of the target from every reviewing authority in the chain. The Inspector General's preliminary report used language rarely seen in federal documents. It described the case file as fabricated from its foundation and called the raid a gross abuse of federal investigative authority. A copy was sent to the Attorney General by secure courier before the end of the day. By mid-afternoon, congressional leaders had been briefed. The chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee released a statement calling the raid an assault on the independence of the federal judiciary and demanded a full public accounting within 72 hours. The ranking member of the House Intelligence Committee requested an emergency classified briefing on how a FISA court order had been obtained using fabricated evidence. By evening, the Chief Justice of the United States had been personally informed. No public statement was issued from the Supreme Court, but sources inside the judiciary later confirmed that the Chief Justice made a single phone call to the Attorney General, lasting less than 3 minutes. The contents of that call were never disclosed. They didn't need to be. The media coverage detonated. Every major network led with the story. Cable news ran split screens showing the quiet suburban house with its shattered window beside Monique's official judicial portrait. Chyrons read, "Federal judge zip-tied in pre-dawn raid," and "FBI accused of fabricating terrorism case against black judge." Legal analysts described the case as unprecedented. Former federal prosecutors called it the most dangerous abuse of investigative power they had ever seen. But it was the doorbell camera footage from a neighbor's house across the street that broke the story wide open. The video, 47 seconds long, showed agents in full tactical gear leading 2 small children out the front door of the house in the gray pre-dawn light. James was barefoot, wearing pajama pants, being guided by the arm by an agent twice his size. Amara was being carried by another agent, her face twisted in a scream, her small hands reaching back toward the house. The footage was posted online by the neighbor's adult son. Within 6 hours, it had been viewed over 12 million times. Within 12 hours, it had been shared by senators, civil rights leaders, journalists, attorneys, and millions of ordinary people who watched a 5-year-old girl screaming for her mother and understood exactly what had happened. The public outrage was immediate and overwhelming. Protest vigils formed outside the FBI's regional field office. Legal organizations issued joint statements condemning the raid. The National Bar Association called for an independent federal commission. Hashtags trended for days. And somewhere inside a quiet office at the Department of Justice, investigators began pulling the thread that would lead them directly to the man who had built the case from nothing and set the entire disaster in motion. Richard Hale was placed on immediate suspension at 4:17 p.m. on the day of the raid. 2 federal marshals met him in the parking garage of the FBI regional field office as he returned from wherever he had been hiding since morning. They handed him a letter signed by the Deputy Attorney General, informing him that he was relieved of all duties, stripped of his credentials, and barred from entering any federal facility pending the outcome of the investigation. His service weapon was confiscated on the spot. His badge was taken. His face showed nothing as he read the letter, but his hands were trembling. Within the hour, a team from the Inspector General's office entered his office on the 4th floor with a federal seizure warrant. They sealed the room with tamper-evident tape, disconnected his desktop computer, removed 3 external hard drives, and boxed every file in every drawer. His government-issued phone was taken. His personal phone was subpoenaed by the end of the day. His email accounts, both official and personal, were placed under a federal preservation order. Every message he had sent or received in the past 6 months was now in the hands of investigators. What they found was damning. Not circumstantial, not ambiguous, damning. Internal messages recovered from Hale's encrypted bureau account showed a clear and deliberate timeline. 3 days after Judge Cole's ruling in the Dreyer case, Hale sent a message to his deputy that read, "She wants to come after us. Fine. Let's see how she handles being on the other side of an investigation." 2 weeks later, he forwarded a file on Raymond Sykes to a colleague with the note, "This one will say whatever we need. He's facing 15 years. He'll cooperate." A month before the raid, Hale wrote in a group thread with 3 members of his team, "Keep her judicial status out of every filing. If it shows up anywhere, this gets flagged before we move. I don't want oversight on this. I want results. The messages continued in a trail that investigators would later describe as the most explicit record of retaliatory fabrication they had ever encountered inside a federal agency. Hale had directed every step: the coach testimony, the manipulated financials, the FISA application, the omission of Monique's identity, the tactical briefing that described her as a civilian. Every lie had his fingerprints on it. Raymond Sykes, the confidential informant, was brought in for questioning within 48 hours of the raid. He lasted less than an hour before he broke. Sitting in a federal interview room with 2 DOJ attorneys and an inspector general investigator across the table, Sykes recanted everything. He admitted Hale had coached him in 3 separate meetings, telling him exactly what to say about Judge Cole, what financial connections to describe, which organizations to name. Hale had promised him a reduced sentence and relocation through witness protection if the case moved forward successfully. Sykes said he never met Monique Cole. He had never heard her name before Hale mentioned it. He had no knowledge of any terrorism network. He made it all up because Hale told him to and because he was desperate. The junior agent who signed the affidavit, Terrence Polk, cooperated with investigators the same day. He confirmed he had been pressured by Hale to sign the document without reviewing the full case file. He said Hale told him the target was a civilian with possible ties to domestic extremism and that the case was time-sensitive. Polk said he never saw any reference to a judicial title. He never knew the target was a federal judge. When investigators showed him the messages proving Hale had ordered the omission, Polk put his head in his hands and said, "He told me it was clean. He told me everything had been vetted." Federal Magistrate Arthur Brennan, the judge who signed the search warrant and arrest authorization, was referred for formal judicial review within the week. Investigators found no direct communication between Brennan and Hale, but the pattern was unmistakable. Brennan had approved the warrant without a hearing, without requesting supplemental documentation, and without verifying the identity of the target, despite the filing containing enough red flags to warrant basic due diligence. Records showed Brennan had approved 97% of all warrant requests submitted by Hale's unit over the past 4 years, a rate that senior judicial officials described as deeply troubling. Whether Brennan had acted out of negligence or deliberate complicity would be the subject of a separate investigation. But either way, his time on the bench was over. Hale sat in his living room that night with the curtains drawn and the television off. His phone was gone. His badge was gone. His office was sealed. The people he had trusted to stay quiet were lining up to cooperate, and the case he had built to destroy a judge was now destroying him, piece by piece, in a way he could not stop and could not control. 4 days after the raid, the Attorney General of the United States stood behind a podium in the main briefing room of the Department of Justice and addressed the nation. The room was packed. Every major news outlet had a camera in position. The Attorney General spoke for 11 minutes without taking a question. What happened to Judge Monique Cole and her family was an unconscionable abuse of federal power and a direct attack on the independence of the American judiciary. A sitting federal judge was targeted, surveilled, and subjected to a violent pre-dawn raid based on evidence that was fabricated from the ground up by individuals within the FBI who used their authority not to protect this country, but to punish a judge for doing her job. Her children were ripped from their beds. Her home was destroyed. Her constitutional rights were violated in ways that strike at the very foundation of our system of government. This department will pursue full accountability for every individual involved, without exception and without compromise. The statement was broadcast live on every network. Within the hour, the president released a written statement calling the raid a stain on the integrity of federal law enforcement and affirming the administration's full support for the independent investigation. The charges came the next morning. A federal grand jury returned a sealed indictment against Supervisory Special Agent Richard Hale on 5 counts. Conspiracy to deprive civil rights under 18 U.S.C. Section 241. Fabrication of evidence in a federal investigation. Obstruction of justice. Abuse of authority. And retaliatory conduct against a federal official. A charge that carried enhanced penalties, because the target was a sitting judge. Hale was arrested at his home at 6 a.m. by U.S. Marshals. He was handcuffed in his driveway in front of his neighbors. The irony of the hour was not lost on anyone. Sergeant Kyle Briggs, the tactical agent who had grabbed Monique by the hair, forced her to the ground, and zip-tied her while her children screamed, was charged separately with assault under color of law and excessive use of force against a federal official. His body camera footage, which had captured every second of his conduct during the raid, was entered into the federal record as primary evidence. 3 additional agents who participated in the raid were placed under formal investigation for failure to intervene, destruction of privileged materials, and conduct unbecoming of a federal officer. Federal Magistrate Arthur Brennan was suspended from the bench pending the outcome of a judicial conduct review. His caseload was reassigned, his chambers were sealed. A preliminary review found that he had approved the warrant in under 9 minutes, without reading the full affidavit, a fact that would feature prominently in the misconduct proceedings that followed. The FBI director requested a private meeting with Judge Cole at her home. He wanted to deliver a personal apology on behalf of the Bureau. Monique's attorney, a former federal prosecutor named David Harmon, responded on her behalf within the hour. The message was 3 sentences long. Judge Cole will not be meeting with the director. An apology does not repair what was done to her children. When the government is ready to discuss accountability, not regret, her legal team will be available. The statement was leaked to the press within minutes. It led every evening broadcast. The headline on the front page of the Washington Post the next morning read, "Apologies don't fix what my children saw." Beneath it was a photograph of the shattered front window of the house on Maple Ridge Drive, the flashbang scorch marks still visible on the hardwood floor inside. The trial of Richard Hale began on a Monday morning in the same federal courthouse where Judge Monique Cole had spent years presiding over cases from the bench. The courtroom was packed. Every seat in the gallery was taken. Journalists filled the press section. Legal observers from civil rights organizations, bar associations, and judicial advocacy groups lined the back wall. Outside, a crowd had gathered on the courthouse steps, holding signs and watching the proceedings on phones through a live audio feed that had been authorized by the presiding judge. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. Over the course of 9 days, federal attorneys dismantled every piece of the fabricated case that Hale had built against Monique Cole. Not by arguing interpretation, but by showing the jury exactly how each lie had been constructed, who had constructed it, and why. Raymond Sykes took the stand on the second day. He described in detail how Hale had recruited him, coached him, and fed him the specific language to use in his testimony. He told the jury Hale had met with him 3 times before the FISA application was submitted, each time refining the story, adjusting the details, and making the fabricated connection between Monique and the extremist network sound more credible. He said Hale had promised him a reduced sentence and relocation. He said he had never heard Monique Cole's name before Hale mentioned it. He said he made it all up because he was facing 15 years, and Hale offered him a way out. Terrence Polk, the junior agent who signed the affidavit, testified on the 4th day. His voice cracked several times during his testimony. He described how Hale had pressured him into signing a document he hadn't fully read, how Hale told him the case was time-sensitive and the target was a civilian, how Hale assured him everything had been vetted by senior attorneys when it hadn't. When the prosecutor asked Polk if he knew at the time of signing that the target was a sitting federal judge, Polk shook his head and said quietly, "No, he never told me. I would not have signed it if I had known. I should have read the file. I didn't. That's on me." The most damaging evidence came on the 6th day, when prosecutors read Hale's internal messages aloud to the jury. The courtroom was silent as each message appeared on a screen beside the witness stand. "She wants to come after us. Fine. Let's see how she handles being on the other side of an investigation. That woman thinks the bench makes her untouchable. Keep her judicial status out of every filing." In the message that prosecutors returned to 3 times during closing arguments, the one that captured the full scope of Hale's intent. She needs to be reminded who holds real power in this country. It's not the judges. It's the people who decide who gets investigated, The defense tried. Hale's attorney, a veteran federal defense lawyer from Washington, argued that Hale had acted on intelligence he believed to be genuine, that the informant had misled him, and that the failure to disclose Monique's judicial status was an administrative oversight rather than a deliberate act. He characterized Hale as a dedicated agent who had served his country for over 2 decades and made a judgment error under pressure. The jury didn't buy any of it. The messages were too clear. The testimony was too consistent. The fabrication was too deliberate. Every piece of the defense's narrative collapsed under the weight of evidence that Hale himself had created. A paper trail of arrogance written by a man who never imagined anyone would read it. Deliberation took less than 5 hours. The jury returned with guilty verdicts on all 5 counts. Conspiracy to deprive civil rights, fabrication of evidence, obstruction of justice, abuse of authority, retaliatory conduct against a federal official. At sentencing, the judge spoke for nearly 20 minutes. He described Hale's conduct as a calculated assault on the rule of law, carried out by a man who swore an oath to uphold it. He noted that Hale had used the full machinery of federal law enforcement to target a judge who had done nothing more than hold the government accountable. He spoke about the children, about the flashbang that detonated in their home, about the 5-year-old girl carried screaming from her mother's arms, about the 8-year-old boy who still had not returned to sleeping in his own bed. Richard Hale was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. It was one of the longest sentences ever handed to a federal agent for abuse of authority. He stood motionless as the sentence was read. He did not speak. He did not apologize. He was led from the courtroom in handcuffs through a side door, while cameras flashed from the gallery and the crowd outside erupted in applause that could be heard through the courthouse walls. Kyle Briggs was tried separately 2 months later. The case was shorter. The body camera footage did most of the work. The jury watched Briggs grab a woman by the hair, force her face into the carpet, and zip-tie her wrists while she screamed that she was a federal judge, and her children cried in the background. They watched him plant a knee in her back and tell her to shut her mouth. They watched James reach for his mother and get shoved into the wall. Use of force experts testified there was no tactical justification for any of the force Briggs used against a compliant, unarmed woman in her own home. Briggs' attorney argued he was following orders from a superior and acting on the briefing he had been given. The jury deliberated for 3 hours. Guilty on all counts. Briggs was sentenced to 4 years in federal prison. As he was led away, he looked back at the gallery once. No one met his eyes. The civil rights lawsuit was filed 6 weeks after the criminal verdicts. Monique Cole's legal team, led by attorney David Harmon and supported by a coalition of civil rights organizations, named the FBI, the Department of Justice, Supervisory Special Agent Richard Hale, Sergeant Kyle Briggs, and 6 additional agents as defendants. The complaint ran 142 pages and cited unlawful search and seizure, excessive force, fabrication of evidence, deprivation of constitutional rights under color of law, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and violation of judicial immunity. The evidence was so overwhelming that settlement negotiations began before the first deposition was scheduled. The government's attorneys knew what the body camera footage showed. They knew what the internal messages said. They knew what the informant had admitted. And they knew that a federal jury had already convicted the primary architect of the raid on every count. There was no version of this case that ended well for the defense. There was only the question of how much it would cost. The case settled for $14.7 million, one of the largest settlements ever paid by the federal government for a wrongful raid. The amount was significant, but it was the non-monetary terms that would carry the most lasting impact. The settlement mandated sweeping structural reforms across federal law enforcement. Independent judicial review would now be required for all warrant applications targeting attorneys, judges, or officers of the court. No warrant could be issued against a member of the judiciary without the target's status being disclosed in the application and reviewed by a specially appointed oversight judge. mandatory identity disclosure requirements were implemented for all federal search warrants, ensuring that the deliberate omission that had enabled the raid on Monique's home could never be replicated through the same procedural gap. A civilian oversight panel for counterterrorism operations was created, with authority to review case files, interview agents, and refer misconduct for investigation, the first body of its kind with genuine enforcement power over national security operations. And new whistleblower protections were codified specifically for federal agents who challenged unlawful orders during operations in the field. Those protections were written with one person in mind: Maya Chen, the junior agent who had stood in Monique Cole's hallway and refused to participate in the raid, was promoted within 6 months of the settlement. She was later invited to testify before the Senate Judiciary Committee about the culture of retaliation inside the FBI, about what it felt like to be the only person in a room full of armed agents willing to say out loud what everyone else already knew was wrong. Her testimony lasted 2 hours. She described the briefing, the moment she recognized Monique's name, the silence when she whispered to her partner, the way he told her to keep quiet. She described standing in that hallway, watching a woman on the floor with zip-tied wrists and 2 terrified children, and making a decision that she knew could end her career. She said she would make the same decision again without hesitation. Monique used a portion of the settlement to establish the Cole Justice Initiative, a foundation dedicated to providing legal defense and psychological support to families subjected to wrongful raids, prosecutorial abuse, and retaliatory investigations. The foundation partnered with civil rights attorneys, trauma counselors, and community organizations across the country to build a network of resources for people who had been targeted by the system and had no one to call. Within its first year, the initiative had taken on 31 cases in 14 states. Monique oversaw its operations personally, reviewing every intake file, because she understood something most people never had to learn: that when the government comes for you in the dark, the law only protects you if someone is willing to fight for it in the light. 6 months after the raid, on a clear Monday morning in early fall, Judge Monique Cole walked through the side entrance of the federal courthouse, took the elevator to the 3rd floor, and stepped into courtroom 4. She wore the same black robe she had worn for 5 years on the bench. Her steps were steady. Her posture was straight. Nothing about her appearance suggested that 6 months earlier, she had been face down on her own hallway carpet, with zip ties cutting into her wrists, and her children screaming in the next room. The courtroom was packed. Every seat in the gallery was taken. Attorneys filled the front rows. Journalists sat with notebooks open. Civil rights advocates and legal observers lined the back wall. And in the very first row, Lorraine Cole sat with her hands folded in her lap. James was beside her, quiet, his left hand gripping the edge of the bench, a habit his therapist said would fade with time. Amara sat on Lorraine's other side, legs swinging above the floor, clutching the same stuffed rabbit she had been holding the morning the agents came. She still woke up screaming some nights, but she was there. They both were. Monique looked out at the gallery. She saw the attorneys, the press, her mother's face, her son's tight grip, her daughter's small hands. She didn't make a speech. She didn't reference the raid or the trial or the settlement. She sat down, adjusted the microphone, and said 5 words. "This court is in session." Outside, a training bulletin circulated through federal law enforcement agencies nationwide. It showed a doorbell camera still frame, 2 agents in tactical gear walking a barefoot boy down a suburban driveway while carrying a screaming 5-year-old girl reaching back toward the house. Beneath the image, 6 words in plain black letters. This is what abuse of power looks like. No names were printed. They didn't need to be. The careers were already gone. If you think this situation was bad, wait until you see what happens in the case on the right-hand side.
Don't move. Not one more step.
I'm standing still.
You expect me to believe this is your house? In this neighborhood? With these homes? You think I'm just going to nod and walk away?
I bought it. My name's on the
I've been patrolling this street for years. I know the families here. I know the cars. I know the...
At 2:47 p.m. on a Saturday afternoon in a quiet cul-de-sac in the Maplewood Estates subdivision, 2 police officers pinned a black man face down on his own front lawn. He was wearing gym shorts and a faded navy t-shirt. His wrists were cuffed behind his back, pressed into the grass hard enough to draw blood. His name was on the mailbox 10 feet away. His military ID was on the kitchen counter just inside the front door. And his 7-year-old daughter stood in that doorway, screaming for her father, while an officer blocked her path with an outstretched arm. The man on the ground was Senior Chief Darnell Carter, an active-duty Navy SEAL with 17 years of decorated Special Operations service. He had survived combat deployments most people would never read about. He had carried wounded teammates through enemy fire. He had earned commendations that filled an entire drawer in his home office. And now he was face down on the lawn he mowed every Sunday morning, bleeding from the wrists, while his daughter begged strangers to stop hurting him. The neighbor who made the call stood on her porch 15 yards away, arms crossed, lips pressed together in a thin, satisfied line. She watched the scene like someone watching a plan come together. She had no idea what she had just set in motion. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you're watching from, and make sure to subscribe because the next story is one you don't want to miss. Senior Chief Darnell Carter was 39 years old. He had spent more than half his life in uniform, 17 years in naval special warfare, rotating between combat deployments, advanced training cycles, and the rare stretches of quiet at home that never lasted long enough. He had been awarded the Bronze Star, 2 Navy and Marine Corps Commendation Medals, and a Purple Heart he never talked about. His record was spotless. His reputation within his unit was simple. Darnell gets it done and keeps his people alive. 6 months earlier, he had purchased a 4-bedroom home in Maplewood Estates, a clean, tree-lined subdivision on the west side of the city. It was the kind of neighborhood with trimmed hedges, American flags on porches, and block parties in the summer. He had chosen it for one reason: his daughter, Zoe. She was 7, bright, fearless, and the only person in the world who could make him laugh until his chest hurt. Her mother, Darnell's wife, had passed from cancer 2 years prior. Since then, it had been just the two of them. Every morning followed the same rhythm. Darnell woke at 500, ran 3 miles through the neighborhood while the streets were still dark, then came home to make breakfast. Eggs, toast, fruit. Zoe always wanted pancakes. He gave in on Saturdays. By the time she was up, the kitchen smelled like syrup and coffee, and for a few hours, the world felt like something other than a mission. But the neighborhood had not welcomed them. Not openly. Not with slurs or signs. It was quieter than that. It was the way conversations stopped when he walked past. The way no one introduced themselves in the first month. The way HOA notices appeared on his door about the height of his grass 2 days after he moved in, while lawns on either side of him went untouched. And then there was the woman next door. Karen Whitfield was 58 years old and had lived on Maplewood Drive for 22 years. She was retired from an office management position at a local insurance firm and had appointed herself the unofficial coordinator of the Neighborhood Watch, a role no one had asked her to fill and no one had the energy to challenge. She knew every car that belonged on the street, every dog walker's schedule, every trash can that stayed out too long. She kept a spiral notebook on her kitchen counter where she logged anything she considered out of place. A van parked too long, an unfamiliar face on the sidewalk, a garage door left open past dark. Her husband Gerald, 61, was a quiet man who read the paper in his recliner and agreed with whatever Karen said, not because he believed it, but because disagreeing cost more energy than it was worth. He never questioned her calls, never asked her to stop, never once walked across the yard to introduce himself to the new neighbor. Karen had opposed the sale of the house from the beginning. Before Darnell had even moved in, she had written 3 emails to the HOA board expressing concerns about maintaining neighborhood character and preserving community standards. She never used the word race. She didn't have to. In the 6 months since Darnell moved in, Karen had called the police 8 times in connection with his property. Once for a plumber's van she didn't recognize, once for a friend of Darnell's who sat in a parked car for 10 minutes waiting to be let in. Once for an Amazon delivery driver who walked to the side gate. Every call was logged by dispatch. Every call resulted in no violation, no arrest, no crime. But Karen kept calling, and she kept writing in her notebook. Times he left, times he returned, how many lights were on at night, whether the garage was open or closed. She watched his house the way a person watches something they believe doesn't belong. That Saturday afternoon, Darnell was in his open garage assembling a basketball hoop he had ordered for Zoe's birthday. The box was spread across the driveway, parts and bolts laid out on a towel, instructions pinned under a wrench. He had a small speaker playing music on the workbench and a glass of water beside it. Zoe was inside watching cartoons, checking through the window every few minutes to see how the hoop was coming along. It was the kind of scene that played out in driveways across the country every weekend. A father building something for his kid. Nothing more. But from her kitchen window, Karen Whitfield saw something different. She saw a black man in her neighbor's garage with tools and open boxes. She watched for less than 2 minutes before picking up her phone and dialing 911. The call was recorded. Her voice was calm, steady, almost rehearsed. She told the dispatcher there was a suspicious black male who appeared to be breaking into a garage at the address. She paused, then added that he could be armed and that she believed there was a child inside the house who might be in danger. Every word was chosen. The mention of a weapon guaranteed an elevated response. The mention of a child in danger ensured officers would arrive fast and arrive aggressive. She never once mentioned the possibility that the man might live there. She never said he was her neighbor. She never described the basketball hoop parts spread across the driveway or the music playing from a small speaker. She described a threat. A black man, possibly armed, near a child. And then she hung up and walked to her porch to wait. Within 4 minutes, dispatch sent 2 patrol units to the address. The call was flagged as a priority, and 2 officers were already reaching for their car doors before Karen had even sat down in her porch chair. The call went out at 2:43 p.m. 2 patrol units were dispatched to Maplewood Drive on a priority response. The dispatcher's notes read, "Suspicious male, possibly armed, child possibly in danger." That language changed everything. It moved the call from a routine check to a high-alert approach. Officers were told to expect a threat before they had even turned onto the street. The lead responder was Officer Ryan Briggs, 36 years old, 10 years with the department. Briggs had built a reputation that depended on who you asked. His supervisors described him as assertive and decisive. Officers who had worked calls with him used different words: aggressive, reactive, heavy-handed. Black residents in the surrounding neighborhoods knew him by pattern, if not by name. He was the officer who always seemed to show up when the call involved someone who looked like them, and who always seemed to find a reason to escalate. 4 formal complaints of excessive force had been filed against Briggs over the past 6 years. 2 involved black men detained during routine stops. 1 involved a teenager handcuffed on a sidewalk for matching a vague description. All 4 had been reviewed internally. All 4 had been dismissed. Briggs had never faced suspension, retraining, or formal discipline of any kind. His partner that afternoon was Officer Dana Sutton, 28, 2 years on the job. She was quiet, competent on paper, and entirely deferential to Briggs. She had never once questioned a decision he made on a call. She followed where he led, did what he did, and wrote her reports to match his. A 3rd unit arrived separately. Corporal James Fenton, 44, was a veteran officer with 18 years of service and a clean record. He had no complaints on file and was known among peers as measured and thorough. He parked at the end of the cul-de-sac and stayed near his vehicle, observing. He did not rush in. That decision, and everything that followed it, would matter later. Briggs and Sutton came in fast. Both patrol cars turned onto Maplewood Drive with lights flashing and sirens cutting through the quiet of the street. Tires barked against the curb as Briggs stopped his cruiser at an angle across the bottom of Darnell's driveway. Sutton pulled in behind him and swung wide to the left. Darnell heard them before he saw them. He set the drill down on the driveway, stepped clear of the basketball hoop parts, and turned toward the street with both hands open and visible at his sides. His posture was straight. His expression was calm. 17 years of training told him exactly what to do and exactly what not to do. Briggs was out of his vehicle before the engine fully stopped. His service weapon was drawn, both hands on the grip, barrel leveled at Darnell's chest from 20 feet away. "Get on the ground now! Hands where I can see them!" Darnell's voice was steady. "I live here. This is my house. My daughter is inside." Briggs moved closer, weapon still raised. "I said get on the ground!" Sutton came around the far side of the cruiser, hand on her holster, cutting off any path toward the side yard. Darnell did not move suddenly. He did not raise his voice. He lowered himself slowly, narrating every motion the way he had been trained. "I'm getting down. I'm kneeling. My hands are open. I am not armed." His knees touched the driveway, then his palms, then the grass at the edge of the lawn. And as Briggs closed the distance with his weapon still drawn, the front door opened. Zoe stood in the doorway in a pink t-shirt and shorts, her eyes wide, her small body frozen for 1 second before the scream came. "Daddy!" Sutton turned and moved toward the door, arm extended. "Get back inside, now!" Zoe didn't move. She screamed again, louder, reaching for her father. Across the street, a man named Victor Langley stepped off his porch, phone already raised and recording. He didn't say a word. He just held the camera steady and let it capture what was happening on Darnell Carter's front lawn. Briggs closed the distance in 3 steps. He grabbed the back of Darnell's neck and drove him forward, forcing his face into the grass. Darnell didn't resist. His arms stayed wide, palms open, fingers spread. Briggs dropped his knee into the center of Darnell's back and pressed down with his full weight. The air left Darnell's lungs in a sharp exhale. "I am not resisting," Darnell said through clenched teeth. "I live here. Please check my ID." Briggs pulled Darnell's wrists together behind his back and snapped the cuffs on hard, metal biting into skin. He yanked them tight, 1 extra click past what was necessary. Then he leaned down, his mouth close to Darnell's ear. "Stop talking." At the front door, Sutton stood with one arm across the frame, blocking Zoe from stepping outside. The child was shaking, tears running down her face, her small hands gripping the door frame. "Daddy! Let go of my daddy!" Sutton didn't bend down, didn't soften her voice. "Get inside, now. Close the door." Zoe didn't close the door. She stood there screaming, 7 years old, watching her father pinned to the ground by a man with a badge and a knee on his spine. Karen Whitfield walked slowly to the edge of her yard. She stood just past her property line, arms folded, watching the scene with an expression that held no alarm and no concern. She said nothing. Briggs searched Darnell's pockets roughly. Gym shorts, no wallet, no weapon, no contraband, nothing. Darnell's voice stayed controlled. "My military ID is on the kitchen counter. My name is on the mailbox. You can check both right now." Briggs didn't look at the mailbox, didn't glance at the front door. He leaned back on his knee and said, "People like you always have a story." From across the street, an older black couple stepped onto their porch. James and Beverly Washington, both in their late 60s, longtime residents of the street. Mr. Washington called out, "That man lives there. He's our neighbor. You're making a mistake." Briggs pointed at him without turning his head. "Sir, step back inside or I will arrest you for obstruction." Mrs. Washington grabbed her husband's arm. Her eyes were wet. They stayed on the porch. They did not go inside. Corporal James Fenton had been standing near his cruiser at the end of the cul-de-sac for nearly 4 minutes. He had watched the approach, the drawn weapon, the takedown, the cuffs. He had heard Darnell identify himself twice. He had heard the child screaming from the doorway, and he had watched Briggs ignore every word the man on the ground said. Fenton walked forward now, past Sutton's cruiser, past the basketball hoop part still spread across the driveway. He stopped at the mailbox at the edge of Darnell's front yard and looked at it. The name was printed clearly on the side in white adhesive letters. Carter. He looked at the man in the grass, then back at the mailbox. Then he walked to the front door where Sutton still stood blocking the child. He didn't go inside. He didn't need to. Through the glass panel beside the door, he could see the hallway. Family photos lined the wall. A man in navy dress blues holding a small girl. The same man on the lawn. The same girl in the doorway. Fenton turned and walked back to Briggs. Uncuff him. Briggs looked up. What? His name is on the mailbox. His photos are on the wall. He lives here. Uncuff him. Briggs shook his head. We need to clear the house first. Could be a domestic situation. Could be anything. Fenton's voice dropped. It was no longer a suggestion. I'm a corporal. You're an officer. I'm telling you to take the cuffs off that man right now. Briggs stared at him for a long second, jaw clenched, then stood up and stepped back without reaching for the cuffs. Fenton knelt down beside Darnell. I'm going to remove these. Stay still. He unlocked the left cuff first, then the right. The metal had cut into the skin on both wrists. Blood smeared across Darnell's palms as he brought his hands forward. The moment the cuffs came off, Zoe broke past Sutton and ran across the lawn. She hit her father's chest before he could even sit up fully, her arms locking around his neck, her face buried against him, sobbing so hard her whole body shook. Darnell held her with both hands and said nothing. He just held her. Fenton stood and spoke quietly. I'm sorry, sir. Behind them, Briggs turned toward his cruiser. His voice was low, but not low enough. This isn't over. Victor Langley's phone caught it from across the street, and the red light on Fenton's body camera had been blinking the entire time. Darnell sat on the front porch steps with Zoe in his lap. She had stopped screaming, but hadn't stopped shaking. Her fingers gripped his t-shirt so tight her knuckles were pale. He rested one hand on the back of her head and kept his breathing steady, the way he did when he needed the people around him to feel that the worst part was over. His wrists were still bleeding. He didn't wipe them. Corporal Fenton stepped inside the house with Darnell's permission and returned a minute later holding a military ID and a folded set of orders from the kitchen counter. He looked at the ID first. The photo matched. The name read Carter, Darnell A. The rank read Senior Chief Petty Officer. The branch read United States Navy. Below the ID in a leather folio were commendation letters, deployment records, and a summary of service that included Naval Special Warfare Group assignments spanning nearly 2 decades. Fenton's expression shifted as he read. He looked up at Darnell, sitting on the steps holding his daughter, wrists raw, grass stains on his shirt, and something tightened behind his eyes. He keyed his radio. Dispatch, this is Corporal Fenton on scene at Maplewood Drive. The call is unfounded. Subject is the confirmed homeowner and an active duty senior chief in the United States Navy. No violation, no crime. Repeat, no crime. There was a pause on the other end, then a quiet, copy. By the cruiser, Briggs leaned against the hood with his arms crossed. Sutton stood beside him, staring at the ground. Neither of them walked back toward the porch. Neither of them said a word. Karen Whitfield's front door closed softly. She had already gone inside. Victor Langley crossed the street and approached Darnell with his phone in hand. Sir, I recorded the whole thing, every second. You need this. Darnell looked at him. Thank you. Mr. Washington walked over slowly, Beverly beside him. His voice was low but firm. She's done this before. To us. To the family who looked at this house before you bought it. They were a young Latino couple. She called the police on them during the open house. They didn't make an offer. Darnell looked at the Whitfield house. The blinds were closed. Beverly Washington added quietly, Every black or brown person who steps foot on this street, she calls. Every single one. It's been years. Darnell said nothing. He just held Zoe tighter and looked at the blood drying on his wrists. Darnell carried Zoe inside and locked the front door. He sat her on the couch, turned on her favorite show, and told her he would be right back. She didn't want to let go of his arm. He knelt down and looked her in the eyes. I'm right here. I'm not going anywhere. Nobody is taking me anywhere. She let go slowly. He went to the kitchen sink and ran cold water over his wrists. The cuts weren't deep, but they stung. Thin lines where the metal had bitten into the skin when Briggs cinched the cuffs past what was needed. He dried his hands, sat down at the kitchen table, and picked up his phone. He didn't raise his voice, didn't pace, didn't slam anything. He called his commanding officer at Naval Special Warfare Command and reported what had happened in clear, precise language, the way he would report a mission debrief. The stop, the drawn weapon, the knee, the cuffs, the language, his daughter in the doorway. The CO listened without interrupting. When Darnell finished, the CO said 2 words: "Stand by." Within the hour, Naval Special Warfare Command Legal was notified and opened a file. NCIS received a formal referral and began a preliminary inquiry into the use of force against an active-duty Special Operations Service member on domestic soil. Darnell's CO made a second call, this one directly to the Lakewood Police Department's Chief of Police. The conversation was short. The tone was not friendly. Meanwhile, 6 miles away, Victor Langley sat in his living room and uploaded the video to 3 platforms. He didn't add commentary. He didn't need to. The footage showed everything. A black man on his knees with open hands, a weapon drawn, a knee driven into his back. Cuffs snapped on while a 7-year-old screamed from the doorway. A woman standing at the edge of her yard with her arms crossed, watching. And one officer's voice, low but audible, saying, "People like you always have a story." By midnight, the video had been viewed over 500,000 times. By morning, it would pass 1 million. And the phones in offices that Briggs and Whitfield had never heard of were already starting to ring. The investigation moved fast. Internal Affairs pulled body camera footage from all 3 officers by Monday morning. Corporal Fenton's camera told the full story. It showed Darnell stepping forward with open hands. It showed Briggs drawing his weapon at 20 feet. It showed the takedown, the knee, the cuffs, the child screaming in the doorway. It captured Briggs' voice saying, "People like you always have a story." The audio was clean. The footage was unbroken. There was nothing to dispute. Officer Sutton's camera was partial. Her angle caught voices but missed the physical contact during the takedown. It showed her blocking the door but cut away before Zoe ran to her father. Useful, but incomplete. Officer Briggs' camera recorded nothing. According to his report, the device malfunctioned during the call. Internal Affairs noted this was the 3rd time in 2 years Briggs' camera had failed during a use-of-force incident. The 911 call audio was reviewed next. Karen Whitfield's words were clear on the recording. Suspicious black male, could be armed, child inside who might be in danger. None of it was true. The mention of a weapon and a child in danger had directly escalated the dispatch priority and shaped how Briggs approached the scene. The district attorney's office flagged the call as potentially criminal. By midweek, the DOJ Civil Rights Division had been contacted and assigned a team. The Pentagon issued a formal inquiry requesting all footage, dispatch records, and officer service files. NCIS expanded its review into a full investigation. Darnell retained a civil rights attorney named Adrienne Caldwell. She reviewed the evidence in one sitting and told him this case would not be quiet. Investigators pulled Karen Whitfield's full 911 history the same week. In 6 months, she had placed 8 calls connected to Darnell's property. A plumber's van, a friend waiting in a parked car, a Friday evening barbecue. 8 calls, 8 dispatches, 0 violations, 0 crimes. They went back further. Over 5 years, Karen had made 14 additional 911 calls involving black or brown individuals on or near Maplewood Drive. A black delivery driver reported as casing houses. A brown teenager on a bicycle reported as suspicious. A black real estate agent reported as an unknown male going door to door. Every call unsubstantiated. Every subject a person of color. Not once had she called about a white person on her street. HOA emails surfaced next. In one, Karen wrote that the board needed to think carefully about the kind of people purchasing in the community. In another, she referenced maintaining the standards that made this neighborhood desirable. She never used the word race. She never had to. A former neighbor contacted investigators after seeing the viral video. Luis and Maria Flores, a Latino couple who had lived on the street for 3 years, described constant police calls, HOA complaints about their yard and front door color, and anonymous notes on their car. One read, "You don't belong here." They moved because fighting was no longer worth it. Karen was interviewed in her living room. Gerald sat beside her in silence. She said she was just trying to keep the neighborhood safe. When investigators asked her to name one specific crime she had ever seen Darnell Carter commit, she couldn't. The investigator closed his notebook. The record said everything she wouldn't. The outcomes came within 2 months. Officer Ryan Briggs was terminated on 5 counts. Excessive force, failure to de-escalate, failure to verify residency, racial bias indicators in his conduct, and suspicious body camera failure, the third such failure in 2 years, a pattern the department could no longer ignore. His law enforcement certification was revoked by the state board. He was barred from working in any policing capacity in the state. Officer Dana Sutton was suspended without pay and demoted for failure to intervene during a use of force she knew was unjustified. Before the disciplinary process concluded, she submitted her resignation. No statement, no apology. She was gone within a week. Corporal James Fenton received a formal commendation for his intervention on scene. In a private conversation with a fellow officer, he said it should have come sooner. "I watched too long." 2 supervisors who had previously dismissed complaints against Briggs were placed under internal review. One had signed off on the dismissal of all 4 prior excessive force complaints. The other had approved Briggs's return to active duty after each incident without requiring retraining. Both were suspended pending the outcome. The Lakewood Police Department entered into a federal consent decree requiring mandatory de-escalation training, independent body camera auditing, civilian oversight of use of force incidents, and quarterly reporting on racial disparities in police contact. Karen Whitfield was charged by the district attorney with filing a false police report and making a false emergency claim involving a weapon. Both were misdemeanors. Both carried potential jail time. But the charges didn't stop there. After reviewing her full 911 history, the pattern of calls targeting Black and brown residents, and the HOA emails referencing the kind of people moving into the neighborhood, federal prosecutors added a charge of conspiracy to deprive civil rights under color of law. The trial lasted 4 days. Karen testified she was just trying to keep the neighborhood safe. Prosecutors played the 911 audio. They presented the 22 unsubstantiated calls. They read her emails to the HOA. They called Luis Flores to the stand, who described the anonymous notes, the constant police visits, and the day his wife told him she didn't feel safe in her own home anymore. The jury convicted Karen on all counts. She was sentenced to 14 months in federal prison and 3 years of supervised release. The Maplewood Estates HOA was named as a co-defendant in the civil lawsuit for enabling and failing to address years of discriminatory conduct documented in their own email records. Darnell's civil rights lawsuit against the city, the officers, and Karen Whitfield was settled before trial. The amount was in the 7 figures. The settlement included mandated department reforms, the creation of an independent civilian oversight board, and a formal public apology issued by the city. Darnell didn't attend the press conference. He was at home with Zoe. The basketball hoop went up on a Sunday morning. Darnell tightened the last bolt, stepped back, and bounced the ball once on the driveway before passing it to Zoe. She caught it with both hands, lined up her shot the way he had taught her, and missed wide. She laughed. He rebounded it and passed it back. She shot again. This time, it hit the rim. That afternoon, James and Beverly Washington walked across the street carrying foil-covered dishes. Darnell had the grill going in the backyard. Zoe showed Beverly her new hoop. James handed Darnell a bottle of sauce and said, "Welcome to the street. For real this time." Karen Whitfield's house sat empty. A for sale sign stood in the front yard. The blinds were drawn. She would not be returning. Darnell didn't talk about her. He didn't talk about Briggs or Sutton or the cuffs or the lawn. Not to the neighbors, not to the press. He had said what he needed to say in his statements, in the courtroom, and in the evidence. That was enough. He used a portion of the settlement to establish a legal defense fund for victims of racially motivated false police reports. People who had been swatted, targeted, and terrorized by neighbors who weaponized 911 and knew exactly what they were doing. He partnered with Adrian Caldwell to build a network of attorneys willing to take those cases. A few weeks later, his commanding officer called. "Darnell, you handled it like a SEAL." Darnell looked through the kitchen window at Zoe shooting baskets in the driveway, the hoop he had been building the day they put him on the ground. "I handled it like her father." The final frame of the body camera footage would circulate for months. A decorated war hero, face down on his own front lawn, wrists cuffed behind his back, his 7-year-old daughter screaming 10 feet away. Underneath it, in every article, every training bulletin, every courtroom exhibit, the same words appeared. This is what unchecked bias looks like. No names were printed. They didn't need to be. The footage spoke for itself. This case was brutal, but the case on the right spirals completely out of control.